Hello, everyone. For decades, fans of the Beatles have debated who George Harrison, the quiet, spiritual, peace-seeking Beatle, truly despised. Because although he built his life around meditation, humility, and detachment, there existed one man whose mere presence could ignite a storm inside him. A man who pushed George to his emotional limits and forced him into battles that shaped his music, his identity, and his legacy. And tonight we're pulling back the curtain on a story the Beatles world rarely talks about openly. A story buried beneath layers of fame, jealousy, betrayal, and artistic frustration. And to understand why George Harrison hated this man more than anyone, we have to travel back to the 1960s when the Beatles were becoming the biggest band on the planet. But inside the group, a quiet tension simmered beneath the surface, especially for George, who was often overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, treated like a kid brother even as his songwriting talents grew at a pace that shocked the industry. But the man George came to despise wasn't John, wasn't Paul, wasn't any of the usual suspects. Instead, it was a figure operating in the shadows, influencing decisions, redirecting careers, controlling money, and manipulating power. And that man was Alan Klein, the infamous, ruthless business manager who entered the Beatles world at the worst possible time, promising salvation at a moment when the band was falling apart, but leaving chaos and broken relationships in his wake. George hated Klein because he saw, more clearly than anyone else, the spiritual destruction this man brought into their lives, the way he played egos against each other, whispering to John one thing, telling Paul another, and injecting poison into a band already bleeding. But before we expose exactly how Klein caused irreversible damage, we must understand where George himself was mentally, because by 1968, George had already begun outgrowing the Beatles' internal politics, having experienced his spiritual awakening in India, discovering Eastern philosophy, finding meaning that went far beyond pop stardom. Yet even with this newfound inner peace, he still carried wounds from years of being creatively diminished within the group. His songs rejected, his ideas dismissed, his role minimized. And it was into this environment that Klein entered like gasoline on a smoldering fire, presenting himself as a savior while secretly destabilizing everything George valued. Beginning with money, as Klein manipulated financial arrangements, gained control of band operations, and pushed deals that benefited him more than them. And although John Lennon embraced Klein instantly, seeing in him a father figure who spoke bluntly, George saw through the disguise, recognizing the greed, the ego, the manipulation, and this created an explosive divide because suddenly George, the quiet one, had to fight to protect the spiritual and musical integrity he was clinging to. Their hatred grew deeper when Klein began interfering with George's solo work, challenging his decisions, pushing back against his collaborations, and even attempting to block musicians George admired, while also encouraging tensions between George and Paul during the Let It Be sessions. And when Klein later became entangled in lawsuits that damaged Apple Corps, George's warning suddenly looked prophetic. But even then the damage had been done. The band was broken, friendships shattered, and trust destroyed. George often said that the fight for control was like watching a house being robbed while the family argued inside, and he blamed Klein more than anyone for manipulating those cracks until they collapsed. But the hatred ran even deeper than business, because Klein also influenced John's withdrawal from the group, accelerating the split, and George saw this as both a personal and musical betrayal, losing not just a bandmate but a brother. And decades later, even after Klein's downfall and legal defeats, George never forgave him, carrying the scars into the quiet years of his life, often hinting in interviews that certain people brought dark energy into their world. And make no mistake, he meant Alan Klein. But perhaps the most heartbreaking layer of this story is that George's hatred wasn't rooted in anger alone. It stemmed from disappointment, because George believed in loyalty, sincerity, and spiritual truth, and Klein represented everything opposite: greed, manipulation, and ego. And as George moved through life embracing the values of peace and compassion, the memory of Klein reminded him of the pain caused when power falls into the wrong hands, the way one person's break influence friendships can and alter poison art. And by the time George passed away, the wounds left by Klein were still visible in the fractured relationships, the legal battles, and the emotional distance between former bandmates. Yet the world never heard the full story, because George rarely spoke harshly about anyone. But when he spoke about Alan Klein, there was no hiding the bitterness, the resentment, the betrayal, and the deep-seated hatred that came from watching his band, his family, torn apart from the inside. And that is why George Harrison hated this man more than anyone. Because Klein didn't just ruin finances or cause conflict, he disrupted the harmony of a band that shaped the world. He exploited vulnerable people for power, and he forced George to confront the darkest parts of fame, greed, and human nature. And tonight, as the truth finally unfolds, we're left with a haunting reminder that even the quietest souls can carry the deepest wounds when trust is broken, and that behind the music, behind the fame, behind the legend, lies a man who fought desperately to protect the things he loved, and learned the hard way that not all enemies stand on a stage. Some sit across a boardroom table, smiling, while everything falls apart behind them. Thanks for watching.